So are you struggling to find the right voltage? Absolutely everyone in the comment section is wondering the same thing. What voltage should I use? The goal of today's video is to actually help you figure out what voltage you should use for your tattoo machine. Because using the wrong voltage will lead to shaky lines, blowouts, teared up skin, or not getting any lines in at all, and we absolutely want to prevent that. So in order to do that, I'm going to give you a couple of quick tips on how to set your voltage in a safe and good way so you can start tattooing safe and properly without causing any trauma to the skin and whatsoever. But before we move on to that, we need to figure out what voltage actually does with our tattoo machine. So what is voltage exactly? Voltage is the electricity that is running through our machine, either from our power supply or through the battery that's inside our machine. On coil machines, voltage is a little bit different, and today I'm just gonna focus on rotary tattoo machines because I have a feeling that people that are using coil machines know a little bit more about machinery than people that are just using rotary machines. Now, on a rotary machine, voltage kind of regulates the speed that the motor is running at. So the higher your voltage is, the faster your machine will run, and the lower your voltage, the slower your machine will run. Most of the time, a rotary machine or like a pen style machine will run anywhere between the 4 and the 9 volts. But there's a large gap in between these is to where you should actually use your machine. And usually these voltage numbers are not provided in the manual with your machine. Now there is a reason why that is, because it's a very personal matter. And we're gonna dive down and actually get a little bit more in depth on how that voltage impacts your tattooing. So a couple of things that are a little bit complicated with tattooing is because voltage is regulating the speed on your machine, you also need to adjust your hand accordingly to the voltage. Now, of course, if you're running your machine super fast, you can move as fast as you want, but it's not gonna cut it. So you need to adapt a little bit to your machine. Now, generally speaking, whenever you're lining, you are running your machine a little bit more on the faster side. So you could probably run it somewhere between the 6-7 volts up to probably 8 or 9 volts. It's still a large gap, but it's smaller than anywhere between the 4 and the 9 volts that I mentioned before. And generally speaking, whenever you're shading, you are running your machine a little bit slower. So probably between the 4 and the 6 volts. And that is still a pretty large gap. Now, what matters the most is basically you need to think a little bit less about the voltage and a little bit more about your hand speed. Because when you are shading, you're moving your hand a lot faster because you need to get these dots a little bit spread out and you can build up your shade like that. Now, whenever you're lining, you want to actually line up those dots perfectly because all the machine does is making this movement with the needle, and you need to line these dots up perfectly to create a solid line. So even if you're using a higher or a lower voltage, you still need to line up those dots perfectly. So the only way you can do that is by moving your hand fairly slow. So a good starting point is to always start with a very low voltage. Now, I'm not saying you should line at 4 volts, but let's say you start with 6 volts. On any pen style rotary machines, I think this is a pretty good starting point. Start at 6 volts and start to line super slow and actually see what happens. So to make life a little bit easier, we need to tackle a couple of problems, which is obviously going to be depth, because the depth of your needle is going to create the right shade or the right line. So what I would advise is to make your needle stick out maximum 2 millimeters whenever your tattoo machine is running, because leaving your needle out too long will create too much differences in depth, and you need to control your depth very consistently. Now, not to be rude, but I think if you're still trying to figure out what voltage you should use, you should not be guessing what depth you're tattooing in. Now, once we got that out of the way, we want to make sure we are stretching very good. Make sure you get a good 3-point stretch with your fingers and the palm of your non-tattooing hand to make sure your needle can actually break the skin. Why is it so important to get these two fundamental things right? is because if you're not going deep enough, you might assume you need to increase your voltage. Or if you are not stretching good enough and you're not breaking the skin, you might think, oh, my tattoo machine is hitting a little bit too weak, I need to increase my voltage, which often is not the case. You're doing one of those two things wrong, and they will make your tattoo machine look bad, pretty much. Your tattoo machine is not bad. Even if you have a dirt cheap bad tattoo machine, you could still play around with voltage in order to get a right tattoo done. Now, although I would not recommend to use a very cheap tattoo machine on someone's skin, it will probably still do the job on practice skin. Now, if we got those two fundamental tattoo things down, we are going to experiment a little bit more with the voltage. Now I'm going to show you from the starting point, so basically with 6 volts, how we are going to create a nice line. And we're not going to change the voltage, but we're going to adjust our hand speed accordingly to the 6 voltage that is running through our machine in order to create a nice solid line. So we're going to gradually slow our hand speed down and see if we can make that line a little bit more solid than it was the first pass. Now, if you start to understand to adjust your hand speed to the voltage your machine is running with, you can feel what is a little bit more comfortable. So if your hand is not stable enough because you actually want to move a little bit faster, you can always increase your voltage a little bit. Now, don't think that tattooing is going to be a race. It actually is not. If you are tattooing way too fast and way too fast hand speed, it's actually like driving 100 kilometers an hour through a school zone. It's just going to cause accidents and all kinds of problems. Make sure you keep a nice, smooth, steady hand speed throughout the whole line, and you can tweak your voltage a little bit from there on. Now, for shading, things work a little bit different. What I always like is to work from a very slow setting, so probably 4.5, maybe 5 volts, and just slowly do a couple of whips and see what actually happens. Now, voltage is a little bit different to every technique of shading, but a general good starting point is just run your machine as slow as possible, do a couple of nice slow whip shades, and see what actually happens on the skin. That is the most important thing, is recognize what you are doing and what you are putting into the skin and what you should adjust from there on. A shade is generally not in solid in one pass, and this is not what you actually want. You want to pass over and build up that shade a little bit, and in order to do that, you need to run your machine slow. That's the only way to actually get that done. Don't put too much pressure on, and just make sure you whip nice and slowly. Now, of course, it depends a little bit on the technique, and also depends on how large the space is that you're going to shade. If you're using a larger space that you need to shade, you might increase your voltage a little bit because you have to make a longer movement. Now, if you're shading in a very tiny spot, you might want to lower your voltage a little bit, because having your voltage too high, you may not create a nice smooth transition. Now, you should always avoid a couple of things when it comes to adjusting voltage, because, for example, what works for me might not work for you. What works for another artist might not work for me or for you. Everybody is different, so don't adjust your voltage by what someone else is doing, but actually see what you're doing and adjust from there on. Another very good thing to know is not every technique requires the same voltage. You might not line at the same voltage where you do your shading, and you also may not do your shading where you do your lining. You might do your whip shading a little bit different than your crosshatch or pendulum swing sort of shading. If you want to shade a little bit softer, or you want to create a more peppery kind of shade, those voltages are going to be different. But I think in this video I gave you a good starting point to actually start from there and just improve your technique and adjust your voltage accordingly to the technique you are applying in your tattoo. So, long story short, what voltage should I use is not a very standard answer. You need to actually figure it out, and I hope I gave you the tools today to help you figure out the voltage and how to use the voltage actually in your advantage instead of seeing it as a hiccup or something. I would love to know if this video actually helped for you, and let me know how this video maybe helped you to figure out the right voltage for your tattoo machine, or let me know how you figured out the voltage for your tattoo machine. So let them know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Now, without further ado, thank you so much for watching. I hope you really learned something from this video and you enjoyed watching this video. Of course, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment and subscribe. And then I will see you in the next video.